For the last part of this lecture set, we'll be talking about finding and reading research. So the primary types of research materials that you're likely to encounter are starting with academic articles. So these are the bread and butter of any research domain. This is where you're going to find almost all original work that gets conducted. So this gets further subdivided into empirical articles. So empirical articles are oftentimes novel. They have actual work, so experiments and studies in them. Not to say that review is not work, but like an actual project was conducted, and then that information is presented. Sort of counter to this are review articles, and review articles oftentimes are used to get a snapshot of where part of the field currently is. So review articles will oftentimes take and examine multiple different empirical articles that are all in the same domain and sort of talk about them together to see what large picture conclusions can be made from all of these multiple studies. Two statistical techniques that oftentimes get used here and that are worth knowing are meta-analysis and effect sizes. So meta-analysis is the process by which one aggregates multiple different types of articles into one sort of review article, whereby one can then examine overall trends. And one of the biggest ways in which people tend to talk about these studies is using effect sizes. The effect sizes are a statistical parameter or statistic, I guess, that allow us to quantify the magnitude of certain types of effects. So if we were talking about the health benefits of eating spinach versus going running every other day, both of those is probably not the same amount of health giving as each other, I guess, one being maybe more than the other. And so effect sizes are a way that we could use to index this, whereby the one that gives larger health benefits would have a larger effect size on health benefits. Another place one will find a lot of research material is in edited books and chapters. And these, either you'll find the individual chapters or you'll see these books, and these books themselves consist of multiple chapters, which is how most books are, except these books, most if not all of the chapters will be written by different authors, where the authors will generally contribute one chapter, and then there will be several editors who are oftentimes also experts in the field, and they will kind of overview all of the different sort of chapters that are submitted, and then it gets published as a book. A lot of times these edited books will all be about a specific topic. So like attentional deployment, decision-making heuristics, emotion regulation, stuff like that. Finally, there are full-length books. These are somewhat rare in psychology, even though they do exist. For example, I have one sitting on the table right now that's about human inference, written by two psychologists. And the entire book is just about how we infer information and the errors we tend to make when inferring other bits of information. Now, when it comes to finding these sources, probably the primary place you want to look is the university library. So it is worth mentioning, even though almost no one will ever look at these anymore, but most university libraries will contain shelves and shelves of physical sources. So these are actually hard copies of journals that contain research articles in them. More common is to use online databases. So if you were to go to the San Francisco University Library website right now, you will find either directly under the search bar or in one of the sort of selection tabs on the left of that screen, an option that allows you to search for articles and databases. It is there that you will go to find sources. Once, excuse me, clicking there, it will ask what material or subject matter you're interested in, right? You would not look for engineering documents in a psychology database and vice versa. And once you've made that selection, you'll have several different options of types of databases to look into. The most common is PsycInfo, even though there are several, and there's a high degree of overlap in the articles that they index. Another service that is offered to you free of charge in the university, part of the library, is the ILLiad program. And what ILLiad allows you to do is if you are unable to find research articles online or physically, you can put in a request into the ILLiad system, and what it will then do is reach out to other universities across the country. believe it's across the country. It's for sure all over California, but I believe it's also kind of spread out across the country. And what will happen is a ping will go out saying, I have a request for this specific article. Do any of you have this article? At which point someone is most likely to say yes, and they will then send that article. I have yet to have an article not show up through Iliad, even though sometimes it has taken a little while. They will even nicely translate articles for you in different languages. So if all of those fail, then you can use Google Scholar, or you can start at Google Scholar if you want and then move to the database, but that's ultimately up to you. Google Scholar, just like Google search engine, allows you to search through academic articles and is quite widely used. Now, you won't always have access to the articles through Google Scholar. I mean, you won't always have access to them through the Scikit databases either, but it's kind of hit or miss with Google Scholar. You will be able to access many more of them when you're logged into the university campus than when you are logging in from home, just because of the way that proxies work, and Google Scholar will recognize that the university institution has access to those articles, whereas you probably do not at your home, just because many of these articles are still unfortunately behind paywalls, which is a sad truth of the current state of science, but people are at least beginning to talk about it, so there's that. The other thing I would mention about Google Scholar is a lot of times you will be able to find PDF copies of the articles. Please just make sure that the articles that you download are actually the articles you think you are downloading. Also, you will occasionally find downloads that are preprints. So you'll see these in more of a Microsoft Word format, even though they'll ultimately be PDFs. They will be large double-spaced format with line numbers all the way down. And these are oftentimes when a journal is not okay with you posting your articles online, because again, it interferes with their money-making business. This is sometimes how researchers get around this and allow them to share their research without actually going against the journals in which they submit those articles. Now, if all of that fails, you can also contact your primary researchers, and most times they will be happy to send you a copy of the document. Now, when it comes to the format of an academic article, just in case, so most of them are going to follow this format, especially empirical ones, though much less so for review ones, even though they have somewhat of a similar structure. You'll start with an abstract. An abstract will rarely be more than 300 words. The abstract will give an overview of the entire paper. It'll be a little bit about why the research was done, a very brief thing of what they did and what they found, and then maybe a sentence or two about the discussion. The introduction following this, sometimes they'll be long, sometimes they'll be short, depending on writing style and the field you find it in. The two main things that we will often find in the introduction are the current state of the literature, so what else is going on in that topic or domain, and then a justification for pursuing whatever the current research agenda is. A lot of times it's not just popping to you out of the blue, and even if a research idea pops into your mind out of the blue, it is still looked down upon to some degree to actually acknowledge that in an academic paper, which I think is strange, but that's just how it is today. And so one will have some degree of background information added into the introduction to sort of backfill that. Please just make sure that you don't start to believe that's why you did the research in the first place, because there is something called, well, there are lots of biases actually related to this type of sort of mental gymnastics. Following the introduction will be the method section. Please remember it is singular, not plural. It will always be the method section, right? What you did for that study. And this is basically going to be a recipe for what they did, right? Who did they study? How did they study? What computer did they use? What programs? What did they show them? What did they make them push? Did they make them stand? All these various things. A good rule to follow for a good method section is that if you could, just looking at the method section alone, recreate the study that they did, that's a good method section. If you cannot, it is an incomplete method section. Though please note, sometimes method sections will be somewhat abbreviated with the remainder or minutia presented in what are called supplementary indexes, which you will either find online or at the back of a paper. Following this will be the results section. This will just be what they found in terms of their actual study. and also basic descriptive information about what was the average age of their participants, the gender demographic, the cultural demographic, so on and so forth. Following this, one will find the discussion. A discussion is basically where one will expand on the findings. You get a little bit more liberty in how you talk about it. And then also oftentimes included in this section will be future directions of what other work would like to be done by the researchers. And more, this is becoming common, but still not quite everywhere, are a discussion of limitations. So what things are limiting in your study itself. And oftentimes, while this might sound counterintuitive, a sign of good research is actually a researcher who points out the flaws in their own research. Because one, they're the best ones to be able to do it because they actually did the research. And two, having flaws in your research is not necessarily a bad thing, but being aware of those flaws is fundamentally important because not only does it allow you to take those into account when you're making your conclusions, but then future work can focus on addressing those limitations. Also, there's probably yet to have ever been a study conducted that has no limitations whatsoever. Following this will be a reference section where all the articles that were referenced in the entire course of the article will be presented. Now, when it comes to reading these academic sources, especially journal articles, please do not just believe everything they say, right? We spend a whole lot of time talking about how it can go horribly wrong when you just accept things, and how even people who are experts can make mistakes. So please don't just believe something someone says because, well, they're human beings and are capable of making mistakes. Now, when it comes to reading these, if you try to keep the following things in mind, I think you'll be on a pretty good track to make sure you can critically examine them. Probably one of the first things you want to do is to figure out what the point or the argument is that they're trying to make. You'll oftentimes find this in the last few paragraphs of the introduction. Now, once you've identified this, make sure to identify it as simply and straightforwardly as possible, just because it will keep it clear in your mind. After that, what did they do to prove this point? Like, what study did they do? What logic did they follow? What other studies did they reference? How are they trying to prove their argument? And what did they do? Following that, kind of related though, are what tools did they use? And are those tools reliable and valid? Now, we'll talk a lot about reliability and validity, I believe, next week, maybe the week after, but probably next week. And one can establish how good tools are and how bad tools are, right? Just think about this as a ruler, let's say, and if you have a very exact ruler, that's a great way of measuring the length of things. But if you have a ruler that's kind of shitty, where not all the increments are the same size, then no matter how much you try to measure something or how carefully you do it, your results are always going to be wrong because the tool you use just doesn't work very well. So another thing to keep in mind is how effective the tools are that people use to prove their point. And while at first you might not have a lot of information about this, as you stick with the field, this will become easier and easier to do. Now, finally, and probably the most critical, is do their findings actually let them make their claims? And what you're going to see here is a lot of times researchers will make very large claims, but the study only shows a very specific item. And so be very mindful of whether or not it's justified to go from the very narrow finding of oftentimes an experiment all the way to a general finding. So if I go all the way back to this venting business, if I'm talking about punching a punching bag with imagining their face will tend to improve or increase their anger. Improve is not the right word there. And so therefore I conclude that venting is bad. But now one could critique this and say, well, punching a punching bag is different than venting, because to me, venting is when I sit with a really close friend who I know won't judge me, who I can tell about my negative feelings, and then they'll be honest with me about whether I'm being crazy or not, right? Maybe that's how someone operationalizes venting. And maybe in that context, the results will look different. And so it's important to keep track of what actually the study itself is showing and what conclusions are the researchers trying to make. And it's very important to make sure that those two line up, because a lot of times what will happen is people will only read the claims that researchers are making and they will not actually look at the work that's behind it, and that can lead to all kinds of obvious problems. Now, lastly, a little bit about sources from other places. So one common place people will find these are retail books. So a lot of self-help books and how to make better decisions and how to be good at talking to people and how to be better at business and yada, yada, yada are actually psychology trade books. They're psychologists or marketing professionals who have written these books, and they're oftentimes written for a general audience. Now, some of them are great, but a lot of them are shit. And not necessarily because they're trying to mislead you, but just because one person doesn't necessarily always understand the entire breadth of a domain. Hence why we write chapter books in actual fields to have multiple people contribute. So be careful when you're reading these. And also, while they're easy to read, they will oftentimes be pretty light on actual information and sources. Another place people go a lot, though you should be wary of, are wikis of any kind. Wikis are great if you need to look up what temperature to roast sweet potatoes at. They're not so great at understanding attentional biases that crop up in the transmission of your optical signals from your eyes to your visual processing cortex, right? It's just, they might have some useful information and sometimes they're great, but for the most part, be careful. Finally, popular media. This suffers from the same drawbacks as retail books because it's oftentimes written in a way that makes it nice and catchy, but not necessarily is it reflecting the actual current state of the research. So a thing of this to be careful for is stuff like Psychology Today. Psychology Today is great fun to read, but if you're going to build your dissertation on it, maybe you should look elsewhere. And I guess, yeah, that's that last sentence right there. These can all be a lot of fun to read, but they will never replace original source material.